You wake in the darkness, and something is wrong. Your eyes adjust slowly to the dim light bleeding through the curtains. But there in the corner of your bedroom, standing utterly motionless, is a figure. Not a person. Not quite. A silhouette so dark it seems to absorb the very air around it. A void in the shape of something human but fundamentally other. Your breath catches in your throat. Your heart hammers against your ribs like a prisoner desperate for escape. Every instinct screams at you to move, to run, to switch on the light, but your body refuses to obey. You are frozen, caught in a paralysis that feels both physical and existential, as this impossible thing stands there, watching you with eyes you cannot see but absolutely feel boring into your soul. The terror is pure and primal, older than language, older than reason. This is the experience thousands of people around the world report with unsettling consistency. This is an encounter with a shadow person. These entities appear across every continent, in every culture, transcending language and belief systems. They materialize in bedrooms at 3 in the morning, drift through hallways in abandoned buildings, and flicker at the edges of vision when you're certain you're alone. They are not ghosts as we traditionally understand them, bound to specific locations or tragic histories. They are not demons from religious texts, seeking possession or demanding ritual appeasement. Shadow people occupy a stranger territory altogether, existing in the liminal spaces between waking and sleeping, between what we can prove and what we cannot explain, between the reality we trust and the nightmare we fear, has somehow bled through. The accounts share remarkable similarities despite coming from people who have never met, who live thousands of miles apart, who speak different languages and hold different beliefs. The figures are consistently described as humanoid silhouettes, darker than the surrounding darkness, often wearing what appears to be a hat or cloak. Some stand perfectly still, content to observe. Others move with unnatural speed or vanish the moment they're directly confronted. And then there are the encounters that turn physical, where witnesses report being held down, touched, or even attacked by these impossible visitors. Are we dealing with entities that exist independent of human consciousness? Beings from some parallel dimension or unexplored corner of reality? Or are our shadow people manifestations of something within ourselves, projections born from the unique neurological state between sleep and wakefulness, ancient fears given form by brains caught in the twilight between dreaming and awareness? The question haunts every investigation, every testimony, every sleepless night spent wondering if that darkness in the corner is truly empty. There are certain images that, once seen, cannot be unseen. Certain experiences that lodge themselves so deeply in the human psyche that they resist explanation, resist dismissal, resist the comfortable rationality we use to order our world. Among all the shadow people reported across the globe, one figure stands apart in its terrifying consistency. He has no name that he has given us, but those who have encountered him in the dark hours of night have given him one. They call him the Hat Man. Sarah Mitchell was 23 years old when she first saw him. It was a Tuesday night in Manchester, England, in 27. She had gone to bed at her usual time, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Somewhere in the deepest hours of the night, she woke suddenly. At least, she thought she had woken. Her eyes were open. She could see her bedroom ceiling, the faint outline of her wardrobe against the wall, the digital clock on her nightstand, glowing a sickly green. But she could not move. Her body was completely paralyzed, locked in place as if invisible chains had been draped across her chest and limbs. This is when she saw him. Standing in her doorway, perfectly still, was the silhouette of a man. He was tall, impossibly tall, his head nearly touching the doorframe. He wore what appeared to be a long coat or cloak, and on his head sat a wide-brimmed hat, reminiscent of the fedoras worn in old detective films from the 1940s. But there were no features, no face, just a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the ambient light around it. Sarah tried to scream, tried to move, tried to do anything, but her body refused to obey. The figure simply stood there, watching her from the doorway, radiating what she would later describe as an overwhelming sense of malevolence. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, the paralysis broke. Sarah gasped, lurching upward in bed, and the figure was gone. She told no one. What would she say? That a shadow man in a hat had stood in her doorway? She convinced herself it had been a nightmare, a trick of exhausted neurons firing in the moment between sleep and waking. She pushed it from her mind and tried to forget. But the Hat Man does not let himself be forgotten so easily. 3 years later, and nearly 5,000 miles away, Marcus Thompson had an almost identical experience. He was living in Chicago at the time, working as a software engineer. It was winter, the middle of January 2010, and Marcus had fallen asleep on his couch while watching television. He woke in the early morning hours, still on the couch, his television now showing only static. And he could not move. His entire body was rigid, unresponsive. Panic flooded through him as he struggled against the invisible force holding him down. That is when he noticed the figure at the foot of the couch. A tall man, wearing what looked like a trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. The figure was utterly black, as if cut from the fabric of the darkness itself. Marcus could make out no features, no details of clothing beyond the general shape. The hat, however, was unmistakable. It sat perfectly positioned on the figure's head, giving him the appearance of something from another era. The Hat Man stood completely motionless, and from him emanated a feeling Marcus struggled to articulate when he later recounted the experience. It was not just fear. It was malevolence. Pure, undiluted ill intent. The figure radiated this sense that it wished him harm, that it fed on his terror, that it was savoring his paralysis and panic. After several minutes, Marcus was able to move again. He sat up violently, gasping for air, and the figure had vanished as if it had never been there at all. Marcus, like Sarah before him, told almost no one. He mentioned it once to a friend who dismissed it as sleep paralysis, a well-documented phenomenon where the brain wakes before the body, creating temporary paralysis and often accompanied by hallucination. Marcus accepted this explanation, though something about it felt incomplete. The experience had been too real, too vivid, too specific. It was only years later, browsing an online forum, that Marcus stumbled upon a thread discussing shadow people. As he read through the accounts, his blood ran cold. Person after person, from different countries, different backgrounds, different decades, described the exact same figure. A tall shadow person wearing a hat. Always a wide-brimmed hat. Always appearing during episodes of sleep paralysis. Always emanating that same sense of focused malevolence. Always watching from doorways, or standing at the foot of beds, or positioned in corners of rooms. Always perfectly still. The consistency is what unsettles researchers and experiencers alike. These are not vague descriptions that could match any number of shapes or figures. These are specific, detailed accounts that align with eerie precision. The hat is always mentioned. The height is always notable. The stillness is always emphasized. The malevolence is always felt. In 2015, a woman named Keiko Yamamoto reported seeing the Hat Man in Tokyo, Japan. She woke in the night, paralyzed, to find him standing beside her bed, looking down at her. She had never heard of the Hat Man. She had no exposure to Western internet forums or documentaries about shadow people. Yet her description matched those given by witnesses across Europe and North America. The wide-brimmed hat, the dark coat, the sense of overwhelming dread. In 2018, a teenager in São Paulo, Brazil, posted online about a terrifying experience. He described waking unable to move, seeing a tall figure in a hat standing in his doorway. His post was written in Portuguese. He had no knowledge of the English language discussions about the Hat Man. He simply wanted to know if anyone else had seen what he called O Homem do Chapéu, the man of the hat. Reports continue to emerge from Australia, from South Africa, from rural communities and major cities, from teenagers and elderly people, from those who believe in the paranormal, and from skeptics who never did until the night they saw him. The accounts span decades. Some researchers have found reports matching the Hat Man's description in journals and letters from as far back as the 1800s, though the term Hat Man itself is a more recent designation. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is not just their consistency, but their emotional impact. Almost without exception, witnesses describe the encounter as one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. This is not the mild unease of a strange dream. This is primal fear. Many report that the Hat Man felt intelligent, aware, purposeful. He was not simply a visual hallucination, but a presence, an entity with intention. Witnesses often use the word evil when describing him. Some say they felt he wanted to harm them. Others say they sensed he was feeding on their fear. Still others report that he seemed to be studying them, examining them like specimens. Jennifer Dawson, a school teacher from Dublin, Ireland, saw the Hat Man 3 times over the course of 2 months in 2012. Each time she experienced sleep paralysis. Each time he stood in her doorway. The first 2 encounters were identical. He simply stood, watching. But the 3rd time, Jennifer reported something that made her experience particularly disturbing. She said he moved. Just slightly. He tilted his head, as if curious, as if acknowledging that she could see him. Then the paralysis broke, and he was gone. Jennifer moved apartments shortly after. She has not seen him since, but she says the memory of that head tilt, that small gesture of acknowledgement, haunts her to this day. The question that emerges from these accounts is unavoidable. How can so many people, separated by geography, culture, language, and time, describe the exact same figure if they have never communicated with one another? How can a teenager in Brazil see the same entity as a nurse in England, with identical details down to the style of hat, when neither has heard of the other's experience? The conventional explanation points to sleep paralysis, a condition that affects millions of people worldwide. During REM sleep, the body naturally paralyzes itself to prevent us from acting out our dreams. Occasionally, the brain wakes while this paralysis is still in effect, creating a terrifying state where the person is conscious but unable to move. Sleep paralysis is often accompanied by hallucinations, typically of figures in the room or a sense of malevolent presence. This phenomenon has been documented across cultures and throughout history, often given different names and interpretations depending on cultural context. The old hag in Newfoundland, folklore. The incubus and succubus of medieval Europe. The Japanese kanashibari dai. All describe similar experiences of nocturnal paralysis and threatening entities. But this explanation, while scientifically sound, does not fully account for the Hat Man's specificity. Why would thousands of people, experiencing a neurological phenomenon, independently hallucinate the exact same figure wearing the exact same style of hat? Sleep paralysis hallucinations vary widely. Some people see demons. Others see deceased relatives. Some see aliens or animals or abstract shapes. The hallucinations are typically influenced by cultural expectations and individual psychology. Yet the Hat Man appears across all of these boundaries with remarkable consistency. Some researchers have proposed the concept of the collective unconscious, a theory developed by psychiatrist Carl Jung. Jung suggested that humans share a deeper level of unconscious mind, populated by archetypes, universal symbols and images that appear across all cultures. Perhaps the Hat Man is such an archetype. Perhaps the image of a tall, dark figure in a hat represents something fundamental in human psychology, a manifestation of primal fear, of the unknown watcher, of death or danger personified in a form that transcends individual experience. This theory has appeal, but it raises its own questions. Why would this particular archetype be so specific? Why a fedora-style hat from the early 20th century? Why not a hood, or a crown, or some other headwear that spans more of human history? Others have ventured into more controversial territory. Some paranormal researchers suggest that the Hat Man might be an actual entity, something that exists independent of human perception. The consistency of reports, they argue, suggests we are dealing not with individual hallucinations, but with encounters with a genuine phenomenon. Some classify him as a type of shadow person, possibly a being that exists in dimensions parallel to our own, occasionally perceived during altered states of consciousness, such as sleep paralysis. Others propose he might be a tulpa, a thought form created and sustained by collective human belief and fear, now powerful enough to manifest independently. Still others suggest darker possibilities, that the Hat Man might be demonic in nature, a malevolent entity that feeds on human fear and appears when people are at their most vulnerable. There is no scientific evidence for any of these theories, but the experiencers themselves often find the conventional explanations inadequate. They know what they saw. They know what they felt. And for many, the experience was too real, too visceral, too specific to be dismissed as merely neurons misfiring in the night. The Hat Man continues to appear. Reports have not diminished with increased awareness. If anything, as more people share their experiences online, more connections are made, more patterns emerge. Some witnesses report that simply talking about the Hat Man seems to increase the likelihood of seeing him again, as if attention itself draws his presence. Others warn against researching him too deeply, claiming that focused interest can act as an invitation. Whether he is a shared hallucination, an archetype from the collective unconscious, an interdimensional being, or something else entirely, the Hat Man remains one of the most consistently reported and deeply unsettling phenomena in the realm of shadow people. He stands in doorways across the world, watching, waiting, radiating malevolence. And those who have seen him are left with questions that may never be answered and an image that will never fade from memory. Sarah Mitchell was 7 years old when the Shadow Man first appeared at the foot of her bed. She remembers the exact texture of the moment, the way her pink cotton bedspread felt clutched between her small fists, the faint smell of her mother's lavender fabric softener that should have been comforting, but instead seemed to amplify her isolation. The figure stood perfectly still, darker than the surrounding darkness, a void in the shape of a man with impossibly broad shoulders and a head that seemed slightly too large for its body. Sarah did what any terrified child would do. She screamed for her parents. Her mother arrived first, flipping on the overhead light with such force that the switch clicked twice. The room flooded with brightness, revealing nothing more than Sarah's collection of stuffed animals and her desk cluttered with colored pencils. Her father appeared in the doorway moments later, his expression cycling from concern to confusion to frustration, as Sarah insisted through desperate sobs that someone had been standing right there, right at the foot of her bed. They comforted her the way loving parents do, checked the closet and under the bed, reminded her that bad dreams can feel very real, and tucked her back in with promises that everything was safe. But Sarah knew the difference between a dream and what she had seen. She knew it with the certainty that only children possess, that unshakable understanding that adults dismiss too easily. The Shadow Man returned 3 nights later, then again the following week. By the time Sarah was 8, she had stopped calling for her parents. She had learned what so many children learn when faced with experiences that adults refuse to validate. She learned to suffer in silence, to pull the covers over her head and wait for morning, to carry terror like a secret she was ashamed to tell. The psychological weight of this isolation, of knowing something is wrong, but being told repeatedly that you are mistaken, creates a specific kind of damage that many survivors of childhood encounters describe decades later. It teaches children that their perception cannot be trusted, that their fear is invalid, that they are fundamentally alone even in a house full of people who love them. Now 42 years old, Sarah speaks about those experiences with the careful precision of someone who has spent years in therapy, learning to trust her own memories again. She describes how the encounters escalated over 18 months, how the Shadow Man began appearing in different parts of her room, how she sometimes felt a presence sitting on the edge of her bed with enough weight to create a visible depression in the mattress. She talks about the morning she found her bedroom door standing open, when she distinctly remembered her father closing it the night before, how she noticed a smell like wet concrete that seemed to accompany the figure's appearances. Most painfully, she recalls the increasing exasperation in her parents' voices, the subtle implications that she was seeking attention, the unspoken suggestion that she needed to grow up and stop with the dramatics. The Mitchell family lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in suburban Connecticut, and Sarah's younger brother Thomas had the room directly across the hall. Thomas was only 5 when Sarah's encounters began, too young to articulate what he was experiencing, but old enough to begin refusing to sleep in his own room. Their mother attributed this to typical childhood separation anxiety, never making the connection that both children had simultaneously developed sleep-related fears. It was not until Thomas was in 2nd grade, when his teacher called home concerned about drawings he had made during free time, that anyone noticed the pattern. Thomas had drawn the same figure repeatedly, always in black crayon with such pressure that it tore through the paper in places. A tall, dark shape with no features, standing in doorways and beside beds, watching stick-figure children who cowered beneath blankets. When their mother finally sat both children down together and asked them to describe what they were seeing, the relief Sarah felt was almost physical. For the first time in 3 years, someone was listening. The siblings' descriptions matched with unsettling specificity. Both described a male figure, unusually tall, absolutely black, with a sensation of weight and presence that distinguished it from ordinary shadows. Both reported that it appeared most frequently between midnight and 3 in the morning. Both mentioned the concrete smell, which their mother had attributed to damp basement air, and both described a feeling of being watched that persisted even when the figure was not visible. Thomas, younger and less conditioned to doubt himself, provided details that made Sarah weep with validation. He described how the shadow man sometimes tilted his head, how he seemed to be waiting for something, how the air felt heavier when he appeared. Their father remained skeptical, suggesting shared nightmares or the influence of scary movies they might have glimpsed at friends' houses. He was a practical man who worked in insurance, someone who dealt in quantifiable risks and statistical probabilities, and shadow people did not fit into his framework of reality. Their mother, however, had begun to notice things herself: doors that opened overnight, cold spots in the upstairs hallway that persisted regardless of the thermostat setting, a pervasive sense of unease that had settled over the house like dust. She started staying awake later, listening, paying attention to the sounds of the house in ways she never had before. The night everything changed for the Mitchell family came in October of 1997, when Sarah was 9 and Thomas was 7. Their father was traveling for work, and their mother had fallen asleep on the couch while watching television. She woke around 2:30 in the morning to find the house dark and silent, the television having shut itself off on a timer. As she climbed the stairs toward the bedrooms, she noticed that the hallway seemed darker than usual despite the nightlight that was always plugged in near the bathroom. The nightlight was still on. She could see its faint glow, but the light seemed to be absorbed by something standing between the children's bedrooms. She describes the moment of recognition as a full-body shock, like touching an electric fence. The figure she had dismissed as childhood imagination was undeniably present, a human-shaped absence of light that her rational mind could not explain away. She stood frozen on the stairs for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. The shadow figure did not move, did not acknowledge her presence, but she felt observed nonetheless. Then, in a movement so subtle she almost missed it, the figure turned its head toward Thomas's room and began to move. Not walking, she insists on this detail, but gliding with a smoothness that was completely wrong. She found her voice and shouted, a wordless sound of protective fury that brought both children stumbling into the hallway. The figure vanished the moment the children appeared, not fleeing or fading, but simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The family slept together in the living room that night, all 3 of them crowded onto the sectional sofa with every light in the house burning. When their father returned 2 days later, he came home to a wife who had barely slept and children who refused to go upstairs even in broad daylight. To his credit, he listened. He did not dismiss or minimize what his wife described, though she could see the struggle in his expression as his worldview bent to accommodate this impossible thing. They consulted their pastor, considered moving, brought in someone from their church to bless the house with prayers and holy water. The encounters diminished after that, though Sarah believes this had less to do with the blessing and more to do with whatever purpose the shadow figure had completed. Sarah moved out at 18 and has never lived in that house again. Thomas joined the military after high school, seeking structure and rationality, a world where threats were identifiable and could be confronted with training and weapons. Their parents sold the house in 23, mentioning nothing to the buyers about what they had experienced, a decision that still troubles their mother. The family does not talk about those years very often, but the experience fundamentally altered how they relate to one another. Sarah and Thomas share a bond that goes beyond typical sibling relationships, a connection forged in shared terror and eventual validation. Their mother carries visible guilt about the years she did not believe, the countless nights Sarah suffered alone because adults are trained to dismiss what they cannot explain. The psychological literature on childhood trauma increasingly recognizes the damage caused not just by frightening experiences themselves, but by the invalidation that so often accompanies them. Dr. Patricia Jennings, a clinical psychologist specializing in unusual childhood experiences, explains that children who report encounters with entities or phenomena that adults dismiss often develop lasting trust issues and difficulty with self-advocacy. They learn that their perception of reality cannot be trusted, or worse, that reporting truthfully leads to punishment or ridicule. Many develop anxiety disorders, depression, or hypervigilance that persists into adulthood. The trauma, Dr. Jennings argues, is compounded by isolation. Being afraid is manageable. Being afraid and disbelieved is devastating. The Chen family in Northern California experienced something remarkably similar across 3 children over a span of 7 years. Margaret Chen, now 36, her brother David, now 34, and their youngest sister Emily, now 29, all reported encounters with what they described as the same shadow figure. Margaret's encounters began when she was 8 in their family home in Sacramento. Like Sarah Mitchell, she reported a tall, dark figure that appeared in her bedroom, watching her from corners or standing beside her bed. Her parents, both physicians, approached the situation as a potential psychological issue, arranging for Margaret to see a therapist who diagnosed night terrors and suggested a regular sleep schedule and a nightlight. But night terrors do not persist with such consistency, and they do not spread to siblings who sleep on different floors of the house. When David began reporting identical encounters 2 years later, their parents started to wonder if something environmental might be causing shared hallucinations. They had the house tested for carbon monoxide, checked for toxic mold, even consulted with a neurologist about the possibility of some inherited condition affecting visual processing. Every test came back normal. Every medical explanation led to a dead end. Emily was only 4 when she began waking up screaming, too young to provide detailed descriptions, but old enough to draw pictures that made her older siblings go pale with recognition. The same featureless dark shape, the same sense of height and presence, appearing in her toddler bedroom with its cheerful yellow walls and collection of picture books. 3 children, spread across 6 years of age difference, reporting the same entity in the same house. The odds of this being coincidental imagination became statistically impossible. Yet their parents clung to rational explanations, because the alternative was too disturbing to accept. The Chen children, now adults scattered across different states, report similar psychological aftereffects. Margaret struggles with insomnia and has slept with lights on for her entire adult life. David experiences anxiety attacks when entering dark rooms, a challenge he has learned to manage but never fully overcome. Emily, the youngest, has the clearest memories because her encounters continued the longest, until the family finally moved when she was 11. She describes feeling abandoned by her parents during those years, knowing that something was deeply wrong, but receiving only medical interventions that treated her as the problem rather than addressing what she was experiencing. The validation the Chen siblings found came not from their parents, but from each other. In their late teens and early 20s, they began talking openly about what they had experienced, comparing notes with the seriousness of researchers documenting a phenomenon. They discovered consistent details they had never discussed as children. All 3 reported that the figure appeared most frequently on Thursday nights, a detail none of them could explain. All 3 described a sensation of coldness that preceded the appearances, not just in temperature but in emotional quality, a draining of comfort from the environment. All 3 mentioned that the figure seemed most interested in watching them sleep, that the encounters felt like observation rather than aggression. Their mother eventually acknowledged, during a difficult family conversation when Margaret was 28, that she had seen something herself on 2 occasions, but had convinced herself it was stress-induced hallucination. The admission came too late to heal the childhood wounds, but provided a measure of closure. Their father has never publicly acknowledged believing in what his children experienced, though he has stopped offering alternative explanations and has, on occasion, made oblique references to things he cannot explain. These stories of childhood encounters with shadow people share common threads that distinguish them from typical childhood fears or imagination. The persistence of the experiences over months or years, the specific consistent details, the appearance of the same entity to multiple family members, and most significantly, the profound psychological impact of being disbelieved all point to something more complex than simple nightmares. Whether these shadow figures exist as objective entities or as some form of shared psychological phenomenon remains debatable, but the trauma they cause is undeniably real. The children who experienced them, now adults trying to integrate these memories into coherent life narratives, carry scars that validation could have lessened but disbelief made permanent. They learned young that reality is not always shareable, that truth is not always believed, and that sometimes the scariest part of monsters in the dark is facing them completely alone. The human brain, for all its evolutionary sophistication, remains remarkably susceptible to deception. In the darkness of night, when ambient light drops below optimal levels for visual processing, our neural architecture begins making calculated guesses about the shapes moving at the edges of perception. These guesses, researchers have discovered, lean heavily toward detecting threats, particularly humanoid ones. It's a survival mechanism etched into our circuitry over millions of years, when the shadow in the periphery might have been a predator or rival waiting to strike. But this same protective system, neuroscientists now understand, may be generating an entire category of modern encounters with entities that seem to exist in the borderlands between physiology and the genuinely inexplicable. Dr. Balan Jalal, a neuroscientist at Cambridge University, has spent years mapping the terrain where brain function creates phantom experiences. His work focuses particularly on sleep paralysis, a state that affects roughly 8% of the general population at least once in their lifetime. During sleep paralysis, the body's natural muscle atonia, the paralysis that prevents us from acting out our dreams, persists even as consciousness returns. The result is terrifying. The person lies awake, fully aware of their surroundings, yet completely unable to move or speak. But the paralysis itself is only half the phenomenon. What makes sleep paralysis relevant to shadow people encounters is what accompanies it, the overwhelming presence of something in the room. In studies conducted over the past 2 decades, researchers have documented consistent patterns in sleep paralysis hallucinations. Approximately 75% of those experiencing the phenomenon report a sensed presence, often described as malevolent. Many see figures, and these figures share remarkable similarities across cultures and continents. They are frequently dark, humanoid shapes that stand motionless or approach the paralyzed sleeper. Some appear cloaked or hooded. Others seem to lack features entirely, presenting as absorbing voids in human form. The parallels to classic shadow people descriptions are impossible to ignore. The neurological explanation centers on the threat-activated vigilance system. When the brain finds itself awake but immobilized, ancient survival circuits interpret this vulnerable state as potentially dangerous. The amygdala, our fear-processing center, becomes hyperactive. Simultaneously, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which normally moderates fear responses, shows decreased activity. This combination creates a perfect storm for perceiving threats where none exist. The brain, Dr. Jalal argues, essentially manufactures a predator to explain the intense fear response, creating a feedback loop where fear generates the hallucination, which then intensifies the fear. Hypnagogia adds another layer to this neurological puzzle. This transitional state between wakefulness and sleep represents a unique period when the brain's reality testing mechanisms become unreliable. During hypnagogic states, people commonly experience vivid visual and auditory hallucinations. The visual cortex fires in unpredictable patterns, generating images that seem entirely real. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin discovered that during these transition periods, portions of the brain can be essentially asleep while others remain awake. This creates a hybrid state where dream imagery overlays actual perception of the bedroom or hallway. The fusiform face area, a region of the brain specialized for facial recognition, plays a particularly fascinating role. This neural structure is so finely tuned, so sensitive to facial patterns, that it regularly identifies faces where none exist. We see faces in clouds, in burn marks on toast, in the random arrangement of shadows on a wall. This phenomenon, called pareidolia, represents the face detection system producing false positives. Better to mistake a rock formation for a face than to miss an actual human hiding in the foliage. In low light conditions, when visual information becomes degraded and incomplete, the fusiform face area goes into overdrive. attempting to construct complete faces from fragmentary data. Dr. Stephen Goldstein, a vision researcher at Berkeley, has demonstrated how dramatically our visual processing changes in darkness. In experiments using controlled lighting conditions, subjects consistently reported seeing movement and shapes in static environments when illumination dropped below 5 lux, roughly the light level of a dimly lit bedroom. The brain, receiving insufficient visual data, begins filling in gaps based on expectation and past experience. Movement is particularly prone to false detection. Our peripheral vision is designed to catch motion, triggering an automatic attention shift. In darkness, visual noise, random firing of retinal cells lacking adequate input, gets interpreted as movement. These explanations form a compelling framework. Sleep paralysis accounts for bedroom encounters. Hypnagogia explains hallway sightings during nighttime walking. Pareidolia and low-light processing errors cover the fleeting peripheral glimpses. The case seems closed, the mystery resolved through rigorous scientific investigation. Except the framework, as comprehensive as it appears, leaves too many encounters unexplained. Consider the case documented by researchers in Portland, Oregon in 2009. A family of 4, parents and 2 teenage children, simultaneously witnessed a dark figure standing in their living room at 3 in the afternoon. Full daylight streamed through the windows. None of the witnesses were sleeping or transitioning into sleep. All 4 described the exact same entity, a 7-foot-tall shadowy form with no discernible features, standing motionless near the fireplace for approximately 15 seconds before seeming to dissolve. They could describe its exact position, its height relative to furniture, even the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 4 people, fully awake, observing the same anomaly simultaneously. Sleep paralysis cannot explain this. Neither can hypnagogia. The multiple witness cases present the most significant challenge to purely neurological explanations. In Brisbane, Australia, security guards at a warehouse facility both watched a shadow figure move across a well-lit loading dock, captured simultaneously on security cameras that showed nothing but empty space. In Minnesota, 3 college roommates spending an evening together all saw the same dark form pass through their kitchen, each able to point out its path and describe identical details. These cases share a troubling characteristic. The witnesses are not in vulnerable, half-asleep states. They are alert, often engaged in conversation, sometimes in well-lit environments. Then there are the physical interactions, events that push beyond visual hallucination into something that demands different explanations. A woman in Texas describes waking to see a shadow figure at the foot of her bed, which she initially attributed to sleep paralysis until she felt distinct pressure on her ankle, not imagined but physical, leaving red marks that remained visible for hours. A man in Ontario reports not just seeing a shadow person in his hallway, but feeling it brush past him in the narrow space, experiencing a sensation of intense cold and the distinct feeling of physical contact against his shoulder. These tactile experiences introduce elements that visual processing errors and sleep state disorders struggle to encompass. Physical evidence adds yet another layer of complexity. Objects move from their positions, found rearranged in ways that coincide with shadow figure encounters. Photographs capturing unexplained dark shapes that multiple people can examine and discuss. Audio recordings of footsteps or disturbances during sighting. While skeptics rightfully point out that photos can be faked and audio can be contaminated, the sheer volume of such evidence, occurring across decades and continents, resists simple dismissal. Dr. Andrew Nichols, a psychologist who has investigated hundreds of shadow people reports, acknowledges the tension between explanation and outlier. In his clinical practice, he estimates that roughly 60% of cases fit comfortably within neurological and psychological framework. But the remaining 40%, he admits, resist easy categorization. These are the cases involving multiple witnesses, clear daylight sightings, or physical effects that extend beyond subjective experience. They are the encounters that make researchers uncomfortable because they exist in the space where scientific models begin to break down. Some researchers propose that we may be witnessing multiple phenomena incorrectly grouped under one umbrella term. Perhaps some shadow people are indeed hallucinations generated by sleep states and visual processing errors, while others represent something genuinely anomalous that we lack the framework to properly investigate. This splitting of the phenomenon into explained and unexplained categories offers a compromise, but it also feels unsatisfying. It acknowledges mystery while providing no path toward resolution. The neuroscience of shadow people thus presents us with a paradox. The research is sound, the experimental evidence robust. Sleep paralysis demonstrably creates perceived presences. Low light conditions provably generate false pattern detection. The fusiform face area unquestionably produces pareidolia. Yet standing against this fortress of scientific explanation are the outlier cases, reproducible in their details, consistent in their strangeness, stubbornly refusing to fit the models that should contain them. We are left suspended between the illumination of understanding and the darkness of the genuinely unknown, wondering whether the shadows at the edge of vision are merely neural misfires or something far more difficult to explain away. The fluorescent lights in the corridors of St. Augustine Medical Center always seemed dimmer on the night shift. Security guard Marcus Hayes would later tell investigators that this observation, which he initially attributed to aging electrical systems, was actually his first clue that something was fundamentally wrong with the building. When he started working at the hospital in 23, the facility had already been slated for closure. Budget cuts and the construction of a newer medical complex across town meant that St. Augustine was winding down operations, housing only a skeleton crew and a handful of long-term patients who would eventually be transferred. What Marcus didn't know during his first week was that the turnover rate for night shift personnel had reached almost 100% annually, and that the hospital administration had stopped asking exit-in interview questions because they couldn't afford to hear the answers. The first reports came from the custodial staff. Teresa Mendoza had been cleaning hospital floors for 17 years, working the overnight shift because it paid an extra $2 an hour and allowed her to be home when her children left for school. She described her initial encounter with clinical precision, the way someone recounts a story they've told so many times that emotion has been sanded away by repetition. It was a Tuesday night in late September when she was mopping the third-floor hallway in the East Wing. The corridor stretched approximately 150 feet, with patient rooms on both sides and a nurse's station at the far end. Teresa always started at the elevator and worked her way toward the station, a methodical routine she'd perfected over nearly 2 decades. She had made it about halfway down the hall when she noticed a dark shape near the nurse's station. At first, Teresa assumed it was another staff member, perhaps one of the nurses finishing paperwork before heading home. But as she continued mopping, moving closer with each systematic sweep of her mop, she realized the figure wasn't moving at all. It simply stood there, darker than the surrounding shadows, roughly human in shape, but lacking any distinguishing features. No face, no clothing details, just a silhouette of concentrated darkness. Teresa called out, asking if everything was okay, and the figure turned toward her voice. She couldn't see eyes or a head movement exactly, but she felt the weight of its attention shift in her direction. Then it moved backward, gliding rather than walking, and passed directly through the closed door of room 312. Teresa dropped her mop and left the building. She didn't return for 3 days, and when she did, she requested reassignment to the day shift. Her supervisor denied the request, citing staffing shortages, but agreed to pair her with another custodian for night work. That arrangement lasted less than 2 weeks before her new partner, a man named Robert Chen, had his own encounter and quit without giving notice. The nurses had their own stories, though they were initially more reluctant to share them. Nurse Jennifer Kowalski worked in the transitional care unit on the 4th floor, monitoring patients who were recovering from surgery or serious illness before being discharged. Her shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and she spent most of that time charting, administering medications, and conducting hourly rounds. Jennifer prided herself on being rational and scientifically minded. She had a master's degree in nursing and had worked in intensive care units where life and death decisions happen in seconds. She was not, as she would emphasize repeatedly, someone prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs. Her first sighting occurred during routine rounds at approximately 2:30 in the morning. She was checking on a patient in room 421 when she saw movement in her peripheral vision, out in the hallway. When she turned to look, she saw a dark figure standing near the medication cart she'd left outside the room. The figure was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, and seemed to be observing her through the open doorway. Jennifer felt her heart rate increase, that primal response to being watched by something unknown. She stepped into the hallway, and the figure moved away, not hurriedly, but with a smooth, gliding motion that didn't match normal human locomotion. It traveled down the corridor and turned left toward the stairwell, disappearing from view. Jennifer followed, though she couldn't adequately explain why. Professional responsibility, perhaps, or simple curiosity. When she reached the stairwell door and opened it, she heard no footsteps echoing in the concrete shaft, no sound of doors opening or closing on other floors. The stairwell was empty and silent, but the temperature had dropped noticeably. Jennifer could see her breath misting in the air, despite the fact that the rest of the hospital maintained a steady 72 degrees year-round. Over the following months, the sightings increased in frequency and intensity. Security guard Marcus Hayes began keeping a log, documenting each reported encounter. By January of 2004, he had collected 43 separate incidents involving 21 different staff members. The shadow figures appeared most frequently between 1 and 4 in the morning. They were seen in hallways, stairwells, vacant patient rooms, and the cafeteria. Some witnesses reported single entities, while others described multiple figures that seemed to move in coordination, as if aware of each other's presence. The old psychiatric wing became the epicenter of activity. St. Augustine had operated a mental health facility from 1956 until 1993, when changes in treatment philosophy and insurance reimbursement made such units financially unviable. The wing had been closed for over a decade, sealed off from the rest of the hospital with locked doors and disconnected utilities. But staff members reported seeing lights flickering in windows that should have been dark, and hearing sounds emanating from behind the locked doors. Voices, some said, though they couldn't make out words. Others described rhythmic thumping, like someone walking the same path over and over. Marcus Hayes volunteered to investigate the psychiatric wing with another security officer named David Park. They entered on a Friday night in February, armed with flashlights, radios, and a determination to debunk what they assumed were overactive imaginations, fueled by late-night fatigue. The wing smelled of dust and abandonment, that particular odor of spaces where air has grown stale from lack of circulation. Their flashlights cut through darkness, so complete it seemed to have texture, revealing old furniture covered with sheets, abandoned medical equipment, and patient rooms with stripped beds and empty lockers. They made it through the first floor of the wing without incident, documenting their findings with a digital camera and noting nothing unusual beyond expected deterioration. The second floor told a different story. As they climbed the stairs, both men reported feeling a pressure change, like ascending rapidly in an airplane. Their ears popped, and the temperature dropped significantly. David's radio began emitting bursts of static, cycling through frequencies though he hadn't touched the dial. Then they saw the figures. 7 of them, standing in the hallway that connected the patient rooms to the common area. They were arranged in a rough semicircle, and unlike previous sightings where the shadow people appeared and then retreated, these entities held their ground. Marcus described a moment of profound cognitive dissonance, where his brain tried to rationalize what his eyes were reporting. They weren't shadows cast by objects blocking light sources. They were the absence of light itself, 3-dimensional voids in the shape of human beings. And they were aware of the 2 security guards, tracking their movements with an attention that felt predatory. David Park ran on. He later admitted feeling no shame about this reaction, explaining that every instinct in his body screamed danger, and he trusted those instincts more than his professional pride. Marcus stood frozen for several seconds longer, watching as the shadow figures began to move toward him. They didn't walk so much as flow, maintaining their formation as they approached. Marcus backed toward the stairwell, keeping his flashlight trained on the entities. The beam passed through them without effect, creating no shadows and no reflections, as if the light itself was being absorbed. When Marcus finally turned and ran, he heard footsteps behind him, keeping pace despite the fact that shadow people had never before made audible sounds. Both men made it out of the psychiatric wing and immediately filed incident reports. David Park resigned the following day. Marcus Hayes stayed on, though he refused to enter the sealed wing again, and began insisting that all security patrols be conducted in pairs. The hospital administration, facing mounting pressure from staff and increasing difficulty hiring replacements, commissioned an environmental assessment to search for carbon monoxide leaks, mold contamination, or other physical factors that might explain the mass reports of hallucinations. The assessment found nothing. Air quality was normal, structural integrity was sound, and there were no toxins present at levels that would cause cognitive impairment. Nurse Jennifer Kowalski had her second significant encounter in March. She was working her usual night shift when she received a call light from room 418, a patient requesting pain medication. As she prepared the injection and walked toward the room, she noticed that the hallway seemed darker than usual, despite all the overhead lights functioning normally. When she entered room 418, her patient was sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner of the room near the window. The patient, a woman in her 60s recovering from hip replacement surgery, asked Jennifer if she could see them. Jennifer followed the woman's gaze and saw 3 shadow figures standing motionless in the corner. They were distinct from the ordinary shadows in the room, possessing depth and presence. As Jennifer stood frozen in the doorway, one of the figures moved forward, approaching the patient's bed. Jennifer found her voice and shouted for it to stop. The figure paused, and Jennifer had the unmistakable sensation that it was looking at her, evaluating her. Then all 3 entities dissipated, not retreating but simply ceasing to exist, like smoke scattered by wind. The patient requested an immediate transfer and was moved to a different room within the hour. Jennifer filed a report and began searching for another job. She gave her notice in April and was gone by May, joining the exodus of experienced staff that left the hospital critically understaffed. By summer of 24, the night shift at St. Augustine Medical Center was almost impossible to staff. The hospital administration offered significant pay increases, hired traveling nurses at premium rates, and even brought in security personnel from outside agencies. But word had spread through the medical community, and anyone who worked even one night shift reported the same phenomena. The shadow people were becoming bolder, appearing earlier in the evening, lingering longer, and showing up in greater numbers. Some staff members reported being followed home, seeing the dark figures in their rear-view mirrors, or standing in their yards after sunset. The final incident occurred on August 27th. The hospital was down to its last few patients, most of whom would be transferred by the end of September. Marcus Hayes was supervising the night shift with 2 other security officers when they received multiple simultaneous reports of shadow figures throughout the facility. Nurses on 3 different floors reported seeing groups of entities moving through corridors. Custodial staff called from the basement, describing dozens of shadow people congregating in the old laundry facility. And from the sealed psychiatric wing came sounds loud enough to be heard throughout the east side of the building. Footsteps, voices, and the sound of doors slamming open and closed. Marcus made the decision to evacuate non-critical patients and staff. As personnel gathered in the main lobby preparing to leave, they watched through the windows as lights flickered on throughout the psychiatric wing, floor by floor, room by room. The wing had been disconnected from the power grid for over a decade. Then the shadow figures appeared in the windows, dozens of them, standing motionless and facing outward toward the people below. The evacuation continued without panic, but with a sense of urgency that everyone present would later describe as primal. They knew, on some fundamental level, that they needed to leave immediately. St. Augustine Medical Center ceased all operations the following week. The hospital administration cited structural concerns and declined to elaborate. When demolition was scheduled for the following spring, 3 separate contracting companies refused the job after conducting initial assessments. Crew supervisors reported that workers refused to enter certain areas of the building, particularly the psychiatric wing. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. One demolition expert told local reporters that the building felt wrong, and that no amount of money was worth the psychological toll it extracted from anyone who spent time inside. The facility still stands today, boarded up and slowly decaying. Local urban explorers occasionally attempt to enter, though most leave quickly, reporting the same sensations that drove away the hospital staff. The shadow people, according to those few who venture inside, are still there, still watching, still waiting in the darkness of abandoned corridors where the fluorescent lights no longer flicker, and the only witnesses to their presence are those foolish enough to disturb their domain. The shadow realm contains gradations of terror, layers of darkness that descend from mere observation into something far more sinister. For every witness who reports simply seeing a shadow figure, there exists another whose encounter crossed a boundary that should never be breached. These are the cases where the observers became the observed, where watchers became victims, where entities that seemed content to lurk in peripheral vision suddenly reached out and made contact with our physical world. The transition from passive haunting to active assault remains one of the most disturbing phenomena in paranormal research. What triggers this escalation? Why do some shadow entities remain motionless silhouettes, while others lash out with apparent rage or malevolence? These questions haunt researchers who have documented hundreds of cases where witnesses suffered physical attacks from beings that should not, by all rational understanding, possess the ability to interact with solid matter. Marcus Chen was 28 years old when his life changed forever on a humid August night in 2017. Living alone in a converted warehouse apartment in Portland, Oregon, Marcus had experienced the usual unsettling sensations that often precede shadow person encounters. The feeling of being watched, cold spots appearing without explanation, fleeting movements glimpsed in mirrors. But nothing prepared him for what happened at 3:15 in the morning, when he woke to find his bedroom darker than it should have been, as if the ambient light from street lamps outside had been consumed by something standing at the foot of his bed. The figure was tall, Marcus would later tell investigators, easily 7 feet from what he could judge in the oppressive darkness. But it was not merely the height that terrified him. As his eyes adjusted, he could see that the shadow was not standing on the floor, but hovering several inches above it, and it possessed a density, a thickness to its darkness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the minimal light in the room. Then it moved toward him. Marcus describes the sensation of being grabbed as fundamentally wrong, as if the laws of physics had been temporarily suspended. The grip on his throat was cold, intensely cold, yet undeniably solid. He struggled, fighting against what felt like iron fingers pressing into his windpipe, and in his panic, he managed to knock his bedside lamp to the floor. The sudden noise seemed to startle the entity, and it retreated, dissipating like smoke, though not before Marcus felt what he describes as claws raking across his chest as the grip released. When he finally managed to turn on the overhead light, his hands shaking so badly he could barely flip the switch, Marcus discovered 4 distinct scratches running diagonally across his chest. They were deep enough to draw blood, perfectly parallel, spaced exactly as fingers would be spaced. He photographed the marks immediately, and those photographs would later be examined by Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a forensic pathologist with 23 years of experience analyzing injury patterns. Dr. Hendricks's report makes for chilling reading. The scratches, she determined, were consistent with fingernail marks, but the depth and uniformity suggested extraordinary force. More disturbing was her analysis of the bruising that appeared on Marcus's throat over the following 24 hours. The contusions formed a clear pattern, a pattern she identified as consistent with manual strangulation. She could identify what appeared to be 4 finger marks on one side of his throat and a thumb mark on the other. But the measurements troubled her deeply. The hand span, based on the bruise pattern, would require fingers significantly longer than those of an average human adult. Her official conclusion stated that while the injuries were definitely inflicted by some external force, she could not explain the mechanics of how such marks could have been created, given that Marcus lived alone, and his apartment showed no signs of forced entry. The psychological aftermath for Marcus was severe. He developed acute insomnia, unable to sleep in darkness, unable to feel safe in his own home. Within 2 weeks of the incident, he had moved out of the apartment, forfeiting his lease and abandoning most of his furniture. He spent 6 months in therapy, working through post-traumatic stress disorder, and even now, years later, he sleeps with multiple lights on and refuses to discuss the details of that night except in the most clinical terms. But Marcus's case, as disturbing as it is, represents only one point on a spectrum of physical encounters that researchers have documented. Teresa Gonzalez of Santa Fe, New Mexico, experienced an attack that left her with injuries witnessed by emergency room staff. In March of 2019, Teresa woke to find herself being dragged from her bed by what she describes as shadowy hands gripping her ankles. She screamed for her teenage daughter, who came running and turned on the lights. The moment the room brightened, the pulling sensation ceased, but Teresa's ankles bore distinct marks. Hospital records show she was treated for bilateral ankle contusions, consistent with tight gripping. The attending physician noted in his report that the bruises appeared to be handprints, but they were unusually dark, almost black in coloration, rather than the typical purple or blue of normal bruising. More puzzling was the fact that the bruises remained abnormally cold to the touch for 3 days after the incident, a phenomenon the medical staff could not explain. Teresa's daughter corroborated her mother's account, stating that she had seen what appeared to be dark wisps or tendrils retreating across the floor when she entered the room and activated the light switch. These accounts share common elements that appear again and again in documented cases of shadow person attacks. The entities seem to possess mass and strength despite their apparent incorporeality. They react to light, often retreating or dissipating when illumination increases, and their touch is frequently described as intensely cold, leaving victims with a sensation that persists long after the encounter ends. The case that truly changed the landscape of shadow person research, however, belongs to Diane Richardson. Her encounter in October of 2018 provided something that investigators had long sought but rarely obtained: video evidence. Diane was a 42-year-old insurance adjuster living in Columbus, Ohio. She had been experiencing escalating paranormal activity in her home for approximately 3 months. Objects moved on their own, doors opened and closed without explanation, and she repeatedly sensed a malevolent presence watching her from darkened corners. Skeptical by nature, Diane decided to document these occurrences, hoping to either capture evidence or debunk her own experiences as products of stress or imagination. She installed 4 security cameras throughout her home, including one in her bedroom equipped with night vision and low-light recording capability. The cameras recorded continuously, uploading footage to cloud storage. On the night of October 14th, they captured something that has since been analyzed by dozens of experts, all struggling to explain what the footage shows. The bedroom camera shows Diane sleeping peacefully until approximately 2:37 in the morning, when she begins to stir restlessly. The timestamp shows her suddenly sitting bolt upright in bed, though the audio pickup captures no sound that might have woken her. For several seconds, she appears to be staring at the far corner of the room, and here is where the footage becomes truly disturbing. A mass appears in the corner, visible even on the low-light camera as an area of deeper darkness. A shadow that seems to possess 3-dimensional form. It moves, and the movement is fluid yet unnatural, like smoke being pulled in a specific direction rather than drifting. The shadow mass crosses the room, and Diane begins to react. She appears to be struggling, her hands raised as if fighting against something, her body jerking and twisting on the bed. The audio captures her voice, strained and terrified, saying, "Get off me, get away." And then a choking sound as her words cut off abruptly. Her hands go to her throat, clawing at something invisible. And then the furniture begins to move. The nightstand slides several feet across the floor. A chair in the corner tips over with no one near it. Books fly from a shelf, not falling but being thrown, arcing through the air with force. The struggle continues for 1 minute and 43 seconds. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ends. The shadow mass retreats toward the wall and seems to dissolve into it. Diane collapses back onto the bed, gasping and sobbing, her hands still at her throat. When she reviewed the footage the next morning, Diane immediately contacted police, believing she had documented evidence of an intruder. Officers who responded found no signs of forced entry, no evidence that any person had been in the home besides Diane. But they did photograph the injuries on her neck. Like Marcus Chen before her, Diane bore bruises in a handprint pattern, dark contusions that clearly showed individual finger marks. The video footage was submitted to multiple experts for analysis. Dr. Richard Kellerman, a video forensics specialist who has testified in over 200 criminal cases, examined the recording for signs of tampering, editing, or digital manipulation. His analysis found no evidence of alterations. The metadata confirmed the timestamp and continuous recording. The shadow mass visible in the footage could not be explained as a camera artifact, lens flare, or any known technical glitch. In his official report, Dr. Kellerman stated that the footage appeared to be authentic and unaltered, but he could provide no explanation for what it actually showed. Jennifer Thorne, a physicist specializing in optics and light behavior, offered a different perspective. She noted that the shadow mass appeared to absorb light rather than simply blocking it, creating what she described as an area of negative illumination. This, she explained, should not be possible under known physical laws. Light can be blocked or reflected, but the apparent active absorption of photons by a moving, seemingly intentional entity defied conventional understanding. The psychological impact on Diane was catastrophic. Despite the video evidence, or perhaps because of it, she found herself unable to process what had happened to her. The concrete proof that something impossible had occurred, that she had been physically attacked by an entity that should not exist, shattered her sense of reality. She spent 2 weeks in a psychiatric facility, not because anyone believed she was delusional, but because the trauma of the experience had left her unable to function. Diane eventually sold her home, taking a substantial financial loss to escape as quickly as possible. She relocated to a different state, changing jobs and essentially rebuilding her entire life. In a recorded interview conducted 6 months after the incident, she speaks in a flat, emotionless tone about the attack. The vibrant personality, evident in photographs taken before October 2018, is gone, replaced by a woman who seems hollowed out, fundamentally changed by her encounter with darkness made manifest. The families affected by shadow person attacks often face a unique form of isolation. Their experiences are so far outside the realm of normal that even sympathetic listeners struggle to fully accept their accounts. When the Anderson family of Spokane, Washington began experiencing violent paranormal activity in 2020, they first sought help from their church, then from paranormal investigators, and finally from mental health professionals. Their 3 children, ranging in age from 7 to 14, all reported being touched, grabbed, and in one case pushed down a flight of stairs by shadowy figures that appeared primarily at night. The physical evidence was undeniable. The youngest child, 7-year-old Emma, was taken to the emergency room after being pushed, bearing bruises on her back consistent with hand impacts. The middle child developed scratches that appeared overnight, marks the parents photographed as they became increasingly desperate to document what was happening. But documentation brought them no relief and no answers. Child Protective Services became involved, suspecting abuse. The parents faced investigation, their desperate attempts to prove that something paranormal was harming their children, instead casting suspicion on them as potential perpetrators. Eventually, the Anderson family abandoned their home, moving in with relatives and essentially becoming refugees from an invisible threat. The father lost his job due to stress-related absences. The mother developed severe anxiety requiring medication. The children underwent months of therapy, not because anyone could help them process encounters with shadow entities, but because the trauma of feeling unsafe in their own home had left deep psychological scars. Dr. Patricia Weber, a clinical psychologist who specializes in trauma and has interviewed over 30 victims of reported shadow person attacks, notes common patterns in the psychological aftermath. Victims display symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, anxiety, and in severe cases, a form of existential crisis where their fundamental understanding of reality has been undermined. What makes treatment challenging, she explains, is that traditional trauma therapy often involves helping patients process and contextualize their experiences within a framework of understanding. But how does one contextualize being attacked by something that should not exist? The physical evidence from these cases accumulates in police reports, medical records, and forensic analyses, yet it exists in a strange limbo of documentation without explanation. Bruises photographed and measured. Scratches swabbed for DNA that yields no results. Video footage authenticated but unexplainable. Each piece of evidence adds weight to the testimony of victims, yet collectively, they remain insufficient to bridge the gap between the paranormal and the accepted physical world. What makes these aggressive encounters particularly terrifying is not simply the physical danger they represent, but the violation of an unspoken boundary. Ghosts and spirits occupy a certain conceptual space in human culture. They haunt, they appear, they may frighten, but they exist largely as observers. Shadow people who attack transform from phenomena to predators, from curious manifestations to genuine threats. This escalation forces a reconsideration of what these entities might be, and what their intentions toward the living might entail. The darkness that watches from corners may not always be content to simply watch. And for those who have felt its grip, felt the cold solidity of impossible hands against their skin, the world becomes a fundamentally more terrifying place, where the boundary between the seen and unseen is not merely thin but actively, violently permeable. In the year 1237, a Franciscan monk named Brother Thomas recorded something disturbing in the margins of a monastery ledger in what is now Bavaria. He described figures he called umbra demones, shadow demons, that appeared in the corridors after Vespers. These were not tricks of candlelight, he insisted, but entities with distinct form and purpose. They moved against the natural flow of darkness, he wrote, crossing walls where no light source could cast them, lingering in doorways with what he could only describe as malevolent attention. Brother Thomas was not alone in his observations, nor was he the first to document such encounters. What he could not have known was that thousands of miles away, across oceans and continents, other cultures were recording strikingly similar experiences with beings that defied the natural laws of light and shadow. The phenomenon of shadow entities appears in historical records with an unsettling consistency that transcends cultural boundaries. In feudal Japan, stories of the Cage Anna, the shadow woman, circulated among rural communities with the same weight as any historical fact. These accounts described a feminine silhouette that appeared at twilight, always in peripheral vision, always watching. Unlike the playful yokai of Japanese folklore that often served moral lessons or explained natural phenomena, the Cage Anna inspired a particular kind of dread. She did not speak, did not interact, but her presence alone was said to drain the warmth from a room and the hope from one's heart. Witnesses across different provinces, people who had no contact with one another, described her in identical terms. A darkness shaped like a woman, darker than the shadows around her, moving with fluid grace that seemed wrong, unnatural. Medieval European manuscripts contain dozens of references to what scholars translated as shade demons or shadow wraiths. A particularly detailed account comes from a 14th century text housed in the Prague National Library, written by a merchant who traveled extensively throughout Central Europe. He documented encounters in various cities and villages, noting that locals in regions separated by hundreds of miles used different names, but described the same phenomena. In Germanic territories, they spoke of Schattenwesen. In Polish lands, they were Cienia Duchy. In the Romance language regions, they appeared as ombres noirs. The merchant himself claimed 3 separate sightings, each following a similar pattern: movement in his peripheral vision, a figure darker than natural shadow, human-like but somehow compressed or flattened, and a sensation he described as being observed by something that understood human vulnerability. What makes these historical accounts particularly compelling is their divergence from typical folklore patterns. Traditional myths and legends generally serve explanatory purposes, teaching moral lessons or providing frameworks for understanding natural phenomena that science had not yet explained. But shadow entity accounts resist this pattern. They offer no moral, provide no explanation for natural events, and serve no clear cultural purpose. They simply record observations, often reluctantly, as if the witnesses felt compelled to document something they could barely comprehend. Native American oral traditions contain shadow spirit stories that predate European contact by centuries. The Navajo speak of beings they call shadow walkers, entities distinct from the skinwalkers of more widely known legends. These shadow spirits are described as watchers, present since the beginning of human memory, existing in the spaces between firelight and darkness. According to traditional accounts passed down through generations, these beings have no clear intent, malevolent or otherwise. They simply are, observing humanity with an interest that remains forever inscrutable. Cherokee elders maintain stories of the NVDA Talanoa, dark spirits that appeared as living shadows during the twilight hours. These stories emphasize the entity's tendency to mirror human form while remaining distinctly inhuman in movement and presence. Perhaps most intriguing are the parallels found in Middle Eastern texts dating back over 1,000 years. References to jinn, beings created from smokeless fire according to Islamic tradition, include descriptions that align remarkably well with modern shadow entity reports. Historical texts describe certain jinn as appearing in forms of pure darkness, silhouettes that absorbed light rather than reflected it. A 9th century Persian scholar named al-Jahiz wrote extensively about encounters with what he called the Dark Ones, jinn that manifested as human-shaped voids in the visible world. His accounts described them appearing in doorways, at the edges of lamplight, and in the corners of rooms where walls met ceiling. He noted their preference for threshold spaces, boundaries between one area and another, as if they existed most comfortably in transitional zones. Historical artwork provides another layer of evidence that our ancestors grappled with these phenomena. Cathedral frescoes from the 13th and 14th centuries occasionally depict strange, dark figures lurking in painted corners, distinct from the demons and devils that appear elsewhere in the same works. These shadow forms lack the elaborate horns, wings, and grotesque features typical of demonic imagery. Instead, they appear as simple silhouettes, human-shaped voids that the artist rendered with obvious intentionality. Art historians have long debated their purpose and meaning, but when viewed through the lens of shadow entity encounters, they take on new significance. An illuminated manuscript from 1512, created in a French monastery, contains marginal illustrations that mirror modern witness descriptions with eerie precision. The artist depicted elongated shadow figures, standing in doorways, their forms clearly defined against lighter backgrounds, their postures suggesting observation rather than action. The accompanying text, written in medieval Latin, describes these as watchers from the outer darkness, beings that have accompanied mankind since Eden, neither fallen angels nor demons, but something else entirely, something that predates human understanding of good and evil. Chinese historical records contain references to shadow beings in texts spanning multiple dynasties. The Song dynasty scholar Shen Kuo, writing in the 11th century, documented accounts of Yangye shadow ghosts that appeared in patterns remarkably consistent with reports from other cultures. He described them as humanoid silhouettes that violated natural laws of shadow and light, appearing where no light source could cast them, moving independently of any physical form. Shen Kuo approached these accounts with scholarly skepticism, yet concluded that the consistency of witness testimony across time and distance suggested a genuine phenomenon worthy of serious documentation. The question that haunts these historical records is whether these encounters represent an objective phenomenon or reveal something fundamental about human perception and psychology. Modern researchers examining these ancient accounts face a peculiar challenge. If we dismiss them as superstition, we must explain why separate cultures, with no contact or communication, developed such strikingly similar description. If we accept them as legitimate experiences, we must grapple with the implications of entities that have accompanied humanity throughout our recorded history. Some scholars propose that shadow entity encounters represent a universal human experience, rooted in how our brains process visual information in low-light condition. Our peripheral vision, optimized for detecting movement and potential threats, may misinterpret shadows and create coherent forms from incomplete data. This explanation accounts for the consistency in descriptions, as all humans share similar neurological architecture. Yet it struggles to explain the specific, repeating details, the sense of being observed, the movement patterns that defy natural shadow behavior, the emotional impact witnesses describe as distinct from ordinary fear. Others suggest these beings, if they exist, have always existed alongside humanity, observing us from the margins of perception. Historical records might represent moments when the veil between a realm and ours grows thin, or individual humans develop the perception necessary to see what was always there. This interpretation treats the cultural variations in naming and understanding as different frameworks for describing the same underlying reality. Medieval Europeans interpreted them through Christian demonology. Japanese culture categorized them within their existing supernatural taxonomy. Middle Eastern traditions placed them within the jinn hierarchy. But underneath these cultural interpretations, the core experience remains remarkably consistent. The question of whether modern sightings represent an increase in activity or simply better documentation remains unresolved. Our ancestors lacked cameras, internet forums, and systematic research methodologies. When Brother Thomas saw his shadow demons in 1237, he recorded it in a ledger margin because he had no other outlet. Today's witness can file reports, share experiences online, and connect with others who have seen similar phenomena. We are not necessarily experiencing more encounters. We may simply be documenting and discussing what has always occurred. What remains undeniable is that shadow entity encounters persist across time and culture with a consistency that defies easy explanation. From medieval monasteries to feudal Japanese villages, from Native American campfires to Middle Eastern scholars' studies, humans have reported encounters with beings that appear as living darkness, watching us from the spaces between light and shadow. Whether these represent external entities, internal psychological experiences, or something that bridges both categories, they form a continuous thread through human history, whispering the unsettling possibility that we have never been alone in our perception of reality, and that some things have been watching us far longer than we have been watching for them. We've journeyed through the accounts, examined the patterns, listened to the witnesses who swear their lives were forever altered by something they saw standing in the corner of their room. We've traced the historical threads and mapped the global phenomenon. But now we must return to the question that started all of this, the question that has no easy answer. What are the shadow people? The neurological explanation carries significant weight. What? Sleep paralysis affects millions of people worldwide, creating a perfect storm of hallucination and terror. During the transition between waking and sleeping, the brain can misfire in remarkable ways. The feeling of a presence, the inability to move, the overwhelming dread. All of these align perfectly with documented cases of hypnagogic and hypnopompic experiences. Skeptics point to our pattern-seeking minds, evolved to spot predators in the darkness, now misfiring in modern bedrooms and creating threats where none exist. They cite studies showing how sleep deprivation, stress, and certain medications can trigger these vivid hallucinations. The evidence is compelling, grounded in reproducible science and measurable brain activity. Yet the neurological model struggles with certain details. How do we explain the consistency of the descriptions across cultures that had no contact with each other? Why do some witnesses report experiences while fully awake, in broad daylight, sometimes with multiple witnesses present? The science gives us tools to understand, but it doesn't quite close the door completely. Then there are those who believe we're dealing with interdimensional entities, beings that exist in frequencies or dimensions adjacent to our own. They point to quantum physics and the strange behavior of particles, suggesting that reality might be far more layered than our senses can detect. Perhaps these shadows are glimpses through a veil that occasionally grows thin, manifestations of consciousness operating under entirely different rules than those governing our physical world. Some researchers in this camp draw connections to ancient texts describing demons and spirits, wondering if our ancestors were describing the same phenomenon using the vocabulary available to them. Others propose that shadow people are manifestations of collective human fear itself, thought forms given shape by the combined psychological energy of millions of frightened minds throughout history. In this model, we've created them through belief in terror, feeding them with our nightmares until they've achieved a kind of semi-autonomous existence. It's a theory that blurs the line between psychology and metaphysics, suggesting that consciousness itself might be far stranger and more powerful than we've imagined. And perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that we simply lack the framework to understand what's happening. Our science, impressive as it is, represents merely a few centuries of formalized study. We're beings who only recently understood that germs cause disease, that the Earth orbits the Sun. What might exist beyond the edges of our current comprehension? What if the shadow people are as real as anything else, but operate under principles we haven't discovered yet, existing in a category we haven't invented the words to describe? Have you ever seen something in your peripheral vision that vanished the instant you turned to look? That flicker of movement that your rational mind immediately dismisses as a trick of the light or tired eyes? What if that instinct to look away, that immediate rationalization, is itself a kind of protection, a mental defense against perceiving something we're not equipped to fully understand? What if they're always there, just slightly outside the range of direct observation, and some people, under certain conditions, simply become able to perceive them? The truth is, we don't know. Despite all our investigations, all our theories and research, The phenomenon remains stubbornly resistant to definitive explanation. The shadow people continue to be reported, night after night, around the world. People continue to wake in terror, continue to see dark figures standing in their doorways, continue to feel watched by something they cannot quite see. The experience remains visceral and transformative for those who encounter it, regardless of whether we can explain it away. So, as you listen to this, perhaps in the darkness of your own bedroom, perhaps alone, consider this. That shadow you see cast against the wall, the one you assume comes from the chair, or the lamp, or the partly open door, are you certain? Are you absolutely certain that it matches the object that should be casting it? And that feeling, that subtle sensation that you might not be completely alone, the one you're already beginning to dismiss as suggestion from this story. What if you shouldn't dismiss it quite so quickly? The shadow people exist in the space between what we can prove and what we fear, between sleep and waking, between seen and unseen. And in that liminal space, in that gap in our understanding, something might be standing very still, watching, waiting for you to turn off the light and close your eyes. Sweet dreams. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.